Darkness did not exist in the Void Labyrinth, not in the way mortals understood it. Light bled through cracks that should not have existed, shifting and twisting like a living thing. Space folded upon itself, corridors bending at unnatural angles, and distances stretched or collapsed at will. The walls pulsed with something neither mechanical nor organic, but something in between. For eons, countless souls had been swallowed whole by its madness, reduced to echoes lost in the endless maze. No one had ever escaped. And then, a human entered. Play. Daniel Carter stood at the threshold, arms crossed, studying the anomaly with a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. His kind should not have been here. Humanity was a new player in the grand game of galactic empires, barely a century into the stars, yet already feared for reasons the elder races could not fully articulate. They were reckless, unpredictable, and utterly indifferent to the supposed natural order of the cosmos. The galactic conquered had been all too eager to test that. Daniel had not been given a trial, nor a battle to prove his worth. He had simply been sentenced, thrown into the Void Labyrinth under the guise of diplomacy, a lesson meant to remind humanity of its place. A warning. The message was clear: submit or be erased. Only they had made a miscalculation. Daniel took a step forward, feeling the labyrinth breathe around him. It whispered, 1,000 voices layered upon one another, testing, prying, searching for cracks in his mind. It had shattered minds before. It had made warlords weep and philosophers beg for death. It had made kings question their divinity, but Daniel Carter was a different kind of monster. The first hour was spent in observation. The walls did not simply move, they responded. They rearranged themselves not in random patterns, but in careful, deliberate sequences, probing reactions, adjusting stimuli. A living enigma. Most would panic. Most would run. Daniel grinned. A challenge. The labyrinth twisted, pulling him into its depths, spirals of shifting corridors weaving around him, dragging time into something incomprehensible. Minutes felt like hours, hours like seconds. Illusions rose around him, crafting perfect replications of Earth, familiar places, faces of long-lost friends. His childhood home, his father's voice calling to him. He snorted. Nice try. The illusion wavered as if insulted. A sound, low, resonant, throbbed through the space around him, something akin to laughter but far older. It was sentient. That much was clear. Daniel's mind whirred, cataloging the patterns. It had tested him with sentiment. It had tested him with isolation. What was next? Fear, pain, madness. He could hardly wait. For the first time in the labyrinth's eternal existence, it hesitated. And somewhere in the farthest reaches of the universe, the galactic concord waited, watching, waiting for the labyrinth to consume the human. Unaware that, for the first time, it was the labyrinth that had met its match. The Void Labyrinth did not like being mocked. It had seen empires crumble, warlords beg for mercy, and the most brilliant minds of 1,000 species unravel into nothingness. It was not meant to be a game. It was a monument to failure, a place where the proudest, the strongest, the most defiant came to die. But this human, this thing, was laughing. Daniel Carter leaned against the shifting walls, arms crossed, watching. The corridors twist and reform. He had already tested a theory. Every time he moved, the walls adjusted in response, leading him where it wanted him to go. Not random, not chaotic, purposeful. The labyrinth was studying him. Fine. He would return the favor. He walked forward, the ground beneath him feeling less like stone and more like a suggestion. His footsteps made no sound. That was new. Even in zero gravity, there was always some reaction, some force applied, but here, the laws of physics were optional. The labyrinth wanted him to feel disoriented. Too bad. Ahead, a corridor stretched in two directions, one lined with smooth black stone, the other writhing with shifting veins of violet light. The latter pulsed, like a heartbeat, an obvious trap. Daniel smirked and took the glowing path anyway. The labyrinth reacted. The moment his foot touched the threshold, the corridor twisted, spiraling into something impossible. Space folded in on itself, a gravitational anomaly tearing at his very being, pulling him downward in a place where direction had no meaning. His body screamed for balance, his inner ear failing to make sense of the shift. Most species would have collapsed, their minds breaking under the sheer impossibility of it. Daniel barely flinched. Years of spacewalking, of zero-G maneuvers, of sheer human stubbornness had prepared him for worse. He adjusted, shifting his stance, letting the new down become his new normal. The labyrinth hesitated. It did not like that. Then the voices came, not whispers, shouts, screams, echoes of the lost. Thousands of voices, overlapping, begging, warning. Some pleaded for help. Some shrieked in agony. Others simply whispered horrors beyond understanding. Daniel cracked his neck. All right, now we're having fun. The walls convulsed in response. A form emerged from the shifting mass, towering. Over him, something neither alive nor dead, something that had once been flesh but had long since been claimed by the labyrinth. A prisoner. A failure. It loomed, hollow eyes burning with remnants of intelligence. You do not belong here. Daniel grinned. Neither do you, buddy. It lunged. Most beings would run. Most beings would fight. Daniel simply stepped aside. The creature's own momentum carried it forward, the labyrinth shifting against it in that instant, swallowing it into another corridor. Gone. Daniel chuckled, sloppy. And that was when he realized he wasn't alone. A figure stood at the end of the corridor watching. Not a hallucination, not an echo. Another prisoner. The being was tall, broad-shouldered, its body wrapped in dark, tattered fabric that may have once been regal. Beneath the shroud, thick plates of biometal glinted under the labyrinth's unnatural glow. A Zelthari warlord, Daniel recognized the species instantly. Zirek the Unbroken, or at least he had been unbroken before the labyrinth had swallowed him. The warlord stared, unmoving. Daniel gave him a lazy salute. You look like hell. A long silence. Then a slow, guttural laugh. Not humor. Amusement, perhaps. Or disbelief. No one laughs here, Zirek rumbled. Daniel shrugged. Guess, I didn't get the memo. Zirek studied him, eyes dark and unreadable. You are human. It wasn't a question. Guilty. A mistake, then. Daniel raised a brow. Oh? How's that? Zirek's gaze swept over him, lingering on the way he stood, the way he smirked in the face of an impossible reality. The labyrinth does not take humans. Well, it does now. Another silence, then. How long? Daniel frowned. How long what? Zirek's voice was measured, but there was something behind it. Something cold. How long until you break? Daniel's grin widened. Hate to disappoint, but I don't break easy. Zirek shook his head. They all say that. Daniel crossed his arms. Yeah? And how many of them walked out? The warlord said nothing. The labyrinth shifted again, the walls twisting into something hungry. Daniel didn't move. Zirek watched him for a long moment, then exhaled. You should not be here, human. Daniel winked. That's what makes it fun. For the first time in centuries, Zirek the Unbroken felt something stir. In his chest, hope. The labyrinth did not like what it saw. This human was not afraid, not cowed, not broken. It had stripped kings of their power, turned geniuses into raving lunatics. It had reduced civilizations to dust. But this one, this thing, laughed in its face. It did not like that. The corridors shifted, forming something new, something it had never needed before. A test, a trap, a lesson. But Daniel Carter was not a student. He was not here to learn. He was here to win. The labyrinth had adapted. It had watched. It had calculated. And now it would correct its mistake. No more illusions. No more whispers. No more wasted tricks. It would break the human. And if it could, not it would erase him. The corridors no longer shifted at random. The patterns Daniel had been tracking, repetitions, mirrored loops, logical inconsistencies, were gone. The labyrinth had learned from his methods, had restructured itself to account for him. It no longer played by its old rules. He grinned. Good. I was getting bored. Zyrek did not share his amusement. The Zelthari warlord had followed him reluctantly, watching with cautious disbelief as the human maneuvered through the labyrinth, like it was nothing more than a particularly aggressive puzzle. Daniel had broken patterns that should have been unbreakable, ignored rules that had bound greater beings in chains of despair. But Zyrek had been here long enough to know one thing: the labyrinth did not lose. Do not mistake amusement for victory. Human, Zyrek warned. Daniel gave him a sideways glance. You worried about me? Worried? Zyrek scoffed. No, but I do not waste time mourning the dead. That's the spirit. The labyrinth trembled. It did not appreciate the mockery. The next shift was immediate, violent, and absolute. Daniel and Zyrek fell, not through space, not through time, but through something deeper, something that folded. The sensation was wrong, in every conceivable way. It wasn't freefall. It wasn't weightlessness. It was the crushing realization that up and down had ceased to exist, that their own bodies were now concepts, rather than constants. And then, as abruptly as it began, it ended. They landed hard. A floor. Solid. Real. Daniel sat up, blinking at the new environment. This was different. A vast open expanse stretched out before them, filled with towering monoliths inscribed with equations that shimmered in and out of existence. Floating, platforms drifted like islands in an invisible ocean, connected by shifting bridges of pure energy. Zyrek groaned beside him, shaking off the disorientation. Where? A voice, sharp and clinical, cut through the emptiness. You are in the thought chamber. Both turned toward the source. A tall, slender figure stood at the edge of one of the floating platforms, garbed in the intricate robes of a species Daniel had never seen before. Her skin was translucent, a faint network of glowing circuits visible beneath its surface. Her elongated head bore no mouth, but her voice resonated with perfect clarity. Zyrek stiffened. Velitha. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Friend of yours. Zyrek's expression darkened. No. Velitha's glowing eyes flickered as she observed Daniel. Fascinating. A human. I had considered the possibility that your species might one day reach the labyrinth, but I did not expect it to be you. Daniel smirked. Yeah, well, I get that a lot. Velitha tilted her head. You misunderstand. I have been here for 4 centuries, and in that time I have calculated every possible outcome. Every probability. Every escape attempt. You should not exist. Daniel shrugged. And yet here I am. Velitha studied him, then turned to Zyrek. Why do you follow him? The warlord's jaw tightened. Because he does not break. A pause. Then, for the first time in centuries, Velitha felt something she had long discarded. Hope. Velitha had once been a scientist, a logician of the Valithar, a species that had prided itself on perfect reason, unshakable logic. The labyrinth had found her arrogance amusing. It had given her riddles, paradoxes, mathematical impossibilities, and let her spiral into madness trying to solve them. She had lasted longer than most, but now, as she watched Daniel Carter, this reckless, unpredictable anomaly, she saw something new. The labyrinth feared him. It had changed its patterns, abandoned its old tactics, adapted. And if the labyrinth had to adapt, that meant it could be outplayed. She stepped forward. The labyrinth has grown desperate. It will no longer rely on confusion alone. It will seek to control you. Daniel stretched his arms. Yeah? Let's see it try. Velitha hesitated. I do not know if your kind is ready for what comes next. Daniel grinned. Lady, my kind was born ready. The labyrinth roared. The monoliths shattered, their floating equations collapsing into streams of raw data that swirled around them. The air became heavy, charged, as if the very concept of gravity had become a suggestion rather than a rule. And then, they saw it. A doorway, massive, intricate, pulsing with an energy that defied understanding. The exit. Zyrek exhaled. It's real. Daniel flexed his fingers. Only one way to find out. Velitha remained cautious. It will not let you pass so easily. The labyrinth agreed. The air thickened, taking form, shadows congealing into figures, specters of those who had failed before. Warriors, scholars, entire civilizations reduced to echoes. Daniel's grin widened. A boss fight? Now we're talking. The labyrinth sent them forward. The specters attacked without hesitation, their forms flickering between realities. Zyrek's blade clashed against an enemy that did not fully exist, while Velitha countered with rapid bursts of energy, her mind working at impossible speeds to analyze weak points. Daniel? He improvised. He ducked, dodged, laughed in the face of creatures that should not be using every trick he had, feints, counters, sheer unpredictability. The labyrinth hated that. It tried to adapt again. But Daniel had already broken its rhythm, and then he saw it. The pattern. The labyrinth wasn't infinite. It wasn't omnipotent. It was just really, really good at pretending to be. And like all great illusions, once you saw the trick, it stopped working. With a final strike, Zyrek's blade cut through the last specter. Velitha's calculations overloaded the final defenses. And Daniel? He walked to the door, smirked and knocked. The labyrinth trembled, the walls shattered, and for the first time in recorded history, the Void Labyrinth opened its gates. They stood at the threshold, staring into the endless void beyond. Zyrek could scarcely breathe. Velitha's mind reeled, her calculations failing to comprehend what had just happened. Daniel Carter turned back to the labyrinth, grinned, and tipped an imaginary hat. Thanks for the fun. The labyrinth did not respond. It was thinking. Daniel Carter had walked through its impossible halls, had laughed in the face of its horrors, and had won. No one had ever left the Void Labyrinth before, until a human walked out, laughing. The Void Labyrinth had never known defeat. It had whispered empires into ruin. It had devoured the prideful, the wise, the unbreakable. It had never failed. And yet, as Daniel Carter stepped beyond its gates, something shifted within its endless corridors. For the first time, the labyrinth hesitated. The human had not just escaped. He had laughed in its face. The exit yawned before them. Vast, infinite, pulsing with the sheer impossibility of freedom. Zyrek stood rigid, his warlord's instincts screaming that it was a trap. Velitha's mind raced, running probabilities, hunting for the inevitable trick. Daniel? He whistled. Huh. Thought it'd be bigger. Zyrek exhaled sharply. Do not mock it. Why not? It's been mocking us this whole time. Velitha took a careful step forward, analyzing the shifting energies. The door is real, I cannot explain it, but the labyrinth screamed, not sound, not language. Something deeper, a command. The exit vanished. In its place, a being emerged, born from the labyrinth itself, shifting between forms, flickering between realities. It was not a creature, not truly. It was every failure, every regret, every prisoner who had ever lost. It was the labyrinth itself given form. A voice like grinding stone filled the void. You do not leave. Zyrek's blade was in his hands before he could think. Velitha's circuits surged, preparing every defense she had. Daniel Carter? He laughed. Oh, now you're mad? What, you thought I wouldn't make it this far? The labyrinth did not answer. It attacked. The air cracked. Zyrek barely had time to react before the void split open, pulling at him, dragging at his form like a black hole given hunger. He roared, driving his blade into the shifting reality, anchoring himself through sheer force of will. Velitha moved like lightning, calculations firing at speeds beyond comprehension. She wove through the madness, tracing energy patterns, searching for the weak point in something that should not have had one. Daniel dodged. No, more than that. He danced. Every strike, every shift, every crushing force meant to obliterate him. He rolled with it. He ducked, twisted, flowed between the chaos like it was a game, like he was enjoying himself. And that infuriated the labyrinth. It struck harder, folding space itself into weapons, sending corridors spiraling into jagged, crushing forces. Daniel grinned. Not bad, but let me show you something about humans. He moved fast, too fast. Not with speed, but with intent. He didn't try to overpower the labyrinth. He didn't try to fight it head-on. He used it against itself. Every shifting wall. He let it push him forward. Every collapsing corridor. He used it to accelerate. The labyrinth had spent eons fighting logic. It had never fought chaos, and Daniel Carter was chaos incarnate. Zyrek and Velitha saw it at the same time. The labyrinth wasn't invincible. It had rules. Twisting, shifting, impossible rules, but rules nonetheless. And Daniel had just broken one. The human laughed in the middle of the impossible, and the labyrinth flinched. Velitha's circuit surged. "It cannot process defiance," Zyrek roared. "Then let us break it." The warlord struck first, his blade carving into the very fabric of the being, tearing reality itself apart. The labyrinth howled. Velitha followed, directing pure energy into the cracks forming within its structure. And Daniel just stepped forward. One step, then another. The labyrinth shuddered. "You're scared, aren't you?" His voice was almost gentle. The labyrinth froze. And that was it. The secret. It was never a prison. It was a test. And Daniel had passed. The being collapsed into light. The void shattered. The gate reappeared, wide open. Zyrek did not move at first. Velitha hesitated. Neither could comprehend what had just happened. Daniel? He walked forward, without a care, and the labyrinth did not stop him. It did not dare. One by one, they stepped through, three beings who had defied the impossible. Three minds that had proven the labyrinth wrong, and as Daniel Carter left the Void Labyrinth, he did what no one had ever done before. He laughed. Across the stars, the Galactic Concord received the impossible transmission. The Void Labyrinth, the ultimate punishment, the eternal exile, had failed. A human had walked in and walked out, laughing. The moment Daniel Carter, Zyrek, and Velitha stepped beyond the gate, reality reasserted itself. No shifting corridors, no whispered voices, no impossible geometry, just the cold, endless stretch of space. The Void Labyrinth was behind them, and they were free. Zyrek's breath came slow and measured, his warlord's heart struggling to accept what his mind already knew. He had spent decades in that nightmare, watching lesser beings crumble, believing himself doomed to share their fate. And yet, he was here. Velitha had long abandoned the concept of emotion, believing herself to be nothing more than a sequence of logical functions. But as she stood beneath the infinite stars staring at the open void, she felt something alien stir within her. Hope. Daniel Carter stretched his arms, rolling his shoulders with a contented sigh. "Welp, that was fun." Zyrek turned to him, his voice thick with disbelief. "You," he exhaled sharply. "You knew." Daniel grinned. "I had a hunch." Velitha's circuits pulsed rapidly as she processed the implications. It was a test. It was always a test. Daniel nodded. Not a prison, not really. Just a big, messy IQ test designed to break people who took it too seriously. He shrugged. Turns out, if you don't fight the labyrinth, if you play with it, You win. Zirek's hands clenched into fists. You expect me to believe that centuries of suffering, of madness, was nothing more than a game? Daniel's smirk softened. Not saying it was fair. Not saying it was right, but you know what's funny? He gestured to the empty void around them. You won. Zirek had no response to that. Because Daniel was right. He was free. For the first time in his life, Zirek the Unbroken had truly won. The moment their escape was confirmed, the galactic Concord was thrown into chaos. Across the stars, species of every kind watched the impossible transmission. The Void Labyrinth, long believed to be a one-way sentence, had been beaten. And not by an elder race, not by an advanced AI, not by an immortal being of cosmic power, by a human. The ruling council convened immediately, struggling to process what had happened. How? This cannot be. The labyrinth is infallible. The laws of reality. The human laughed and walked out. A voice cut through the noise. That is all that matters. Fear spread among the elder species. If a human could defeat the greatest enigma in the known universe, what else were they capable of? Velitha's people refused to acknowledge her return. The Valithar had long believed in absolute logic, in the supremacy of intelligence. And yet their greatest scientist had been freed by an illogical being, one who relied not on calculations but on instinct, improvisation, and humor. She was no longer one of them. She was something else. So she did the only thing that made sense. She left. Zirek did not return to his people. The Zelthari Empire had abandoned him the moment he fell into the labyrinth. In their eyes he was dead. To return now would be to expose their cowardice, their weakness. So he did the only thing that made sense. He went to Earth, and he swore allegiance to the species that had done the impossible. Daniel Carter was offered everything: titles, power, authority. He declined. Instead, he did the only thing that made sense. He turned to Zirek and Velitha, grinning like a madman. So, what's next? The Void Labyrinth had changed. Its corridors, once shifting endlessly, were still. Its whispers, once filled with torment, were silent. It had witnessed something new, something beyond its calculations, beyond its understanding. The human had won. For the first time in its existence, the labyrinth did not know what came next, and that terrified it. Deep in the heart of the galactic concord, where the elder species whispered in hushed tones, a new transmission pulsed through the void. It was not from a government. It was not from a fleet. It was from the labyrinth itself. A single phrase, encoded in every known language, repeating endlessly across the stars. The first has left. More will follow. The implications were staggering. The labyrinth had never acknowledged anyone. It had never spoken beyond its walls, and now it was warning them. The Concord leaders, once confident in their place at the top, felt the weight of something they could not control. Not anymore, because if one human could break the unbreakable, what would happen when more tried? Daniel Carter sat at the edge of a Terran space station, boots propped up on the metal railing, staring at the endless stretch of stars. Velitha stood beside him, arms crossed, her circuits pulsing with calculations, beyond human comprehension. "You are a statistical anomaly," she muttered. Daniel grinned. "I get that a lot." Zirek, towering behind them, exhaled sharply. "The galaxy is afraid of you, human." Daniel tapped his chin. "Good. Keeps things interesting." Velitha's circuits flickered. "You understand what this means. The labyrinth was not just a prison, it was a test. And now that test has been broken." Daniel stretched lazily. "Yup." Zirek crossed his arms. "So what now?" Daniel smirked, his eyes glinting with something dangerous. "Now? We find out what else the universe thinks is impossible." The stars stretched endlessly before them, and the human laughed.